Alors, si vous voulez bien, on va commencer tranquillement. Alors, merci.
We're ready to begin. Thank you, everyone, to be here today.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Alors, can you hear me? D'accord. Allons-y. Alors, l'événement d'aujourd'hui.
So today's event is going to be interpreted. You can see in the far right at the bottom of your page, there's an icon that says interpretation. You can click on it and choose the language of your choice. I will be switching between English and French, and our guests as well. They will be speaking either English or French. I would invite you to activate the interpretation function to choose the language of your preference.
The webinar today is going to be translated, so there is live interpretation available. You can just click on the bottom right of your screen on the icon that says interpretation and choose the language of your choice. I'm going to switch from French to English, and our guests as well will speak either French and or English. So I suggest you turn on the interpretation unless you're very comfortable in both languages. Alors, sur ce, before we start, I would like to thank the Center for Feminist Research and the Liberal Arts and Professional Studies faculty at York University for their support in organizing this event. Je voudrais aussi remercier le Centre de recherche en innovation et transformation sociale de l'Université Saint-Paul pour leur soutien dans l'organisation de cet événement. Alors, comme on va parler de violence aujourd'hui,
So as we are going to be speaking of violence today, I would like to underline the violence that has allowed me to be here today.
I am located on unceded indigenous land today. The Ganyangaga Nation has traditionally been recognized as custodians of the lands and waters on which I stand today. So Jojage in Montreal has historically been a gathering place for diverse indigenous people and First Nations. And today it is a home for a diversity of indigenous and other populations. So I want to recognize and respect the past, the present, and the future connections and the ongoing relationships of the different communities within the Montreal community. Alors sur ce, je voudrais remercier nos panélistes d'avoir accepté d'être ici
So I'd
aujourd'hui.
like to thank our guests for being with us today. They need no introduction, but I will still present them to you. So today we have Judith Butler, who is a philosopher and professor at UC Berkeley in California. Their work focuses on gender, queer theory, and vulnerability. They also teach philosophy that are very influential work on gender, on precarity, and on questions today, such as the strength of nonviolence. Françoise Vergès is a decolonial anti-racist feminist, an independent curator, and a writer. She grew up in La Réunion and was raised by anti-colonial communist and feminist parents. She has lived in Alger, Paris, where she works as a journalist and feminist editor. Vergès has been president of the Comité for la Mémoire et l'Histoire de l'Esclavage, has managed the prefiguration team for a post-colonial museum in La Réunion, has written movies, and in 2015 was one of the co-founders of the Décolonisons les Arts Association. Her recent publications include Of Colonial Violence in the Public Space, A Decolonial Feminism, and A Feminist Theory of Violence.
Of which we will speak of today. And finally, Elsa Dorlin is professor of contemporary political philosophy at the Université Toulouse-Jean Jaurès. She has authored many books, including The Race Matrix, Sexual and Colonial Genealogy of the French Nation, Sex, Gender, and Sexualities, and Defending Oneself, A Philosophy of Violence. Donc voilà, le webinaire aujourd'hui.
So this is the webinar of today. It aims to bring a dialogue about the recent work that addresses issues of violence, nonviolence, protection, and self-defense from a feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial perspective. The discussion will be revolving around, it'll be a dialogue between three questions, three primary questions that will be interspersed with questions from the audience.
I invite you to share your questions in the Q&A. You can write questions for discussions at any time, as well as technical questions if you have any. So we're going to answer. It's visible for all. Once we start, I would ask you, if possible, to keep the Q&A for questions and avoid comments so we just don't get lost in it. Alors voilà. Je pense qu'il y a un certain enjeu technique.
I think we have a certain technical issue concerning the images.
Donc, on va essayer de régler ça. Je vais juste demander Professor Butler, Professeur Dorlin, Professeur Vergès. Est-ce que vous nous entendez?
Professor Butler, Professor Vergès, Professor Dorlin, do you hear us? Do you see everything?
Parfait. On vous voit, on vous entend.
Merci, Françoise. Alors, j'entends votre...
Thank you. I can hear you, but I don't necessarily see you, Professor Dorlin.
Et moi, je me vois, je vois Judith.
So I see myself, and I see Judith, but I see Elsa and the others. Do you see everything? Yes, all is good. I can hear you all.
Yes, I see everyone.
Everything is fine. We are ready to begin. So we'll begin with the first question. So your books address issues of violence and particular strategies of resistance to it, but they are very different projects. So Professor Butler, tu explores la question de non-violence et de l'interdépendance plutôt comme une question collective plutôt qu'une question de position morale. Professor Vergès, you're exploring these themes from a state violence from a decolonial perspective against a punitive carceral feminism. Et Professor Dorlin, you explore a genealogy and phenomenology of self-defense between, on one hand, the notion of self-defense by the powerful, and on the other hand, the martial ethics of the self, of those who are not allowed to defend themselves. So can you please start by telling us about your primary arguments?
Alors, si on pouvait commencer avec...
So if we could begin with Judith, Professor.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I think my primary arguments are multiple. So, you know, might take a little while to explain. But on the one hand, I do make a case for tactics of nonviolence on the left, but my idea of nonviolence is one that includes aggression and force. So the point I seek to make in The Force of Nonviolence is simply that when we defend ourselves or when we fight back, we should make sure to use strategies that prefigure the world we want to make. In other words, I suggest or argue that it would be a mistake to reproduce the very structures of violence that we oppose. So that opens the question: what kinds of force, what kinds of resistance, and what kinds of cultivated aggression are there that can resist violence justifiably without replicating the structures of the violence we resist? It's an open question, and in some ways it's a meditation on that question. I don't have a principled view of nonviolence. I don't have a set of Kantian principles that I impose on all situations. I'm not interested in an absolute principle of nonviolence. I'm interested in thinking about it as a practice, as an open-ended one, and to refute the idea that nonviolence comes from a calm or pacific region of the soul. On the other hand, I am arguing something that I believe both Professor Dorlin and Professor Vergès would agree with me on, which is that state violence very often calls itself legitimate force and casts forms of resistance to the state as chaotic or terrorist violence in need of securitarian control. And I seek to understand how state-based violence, but legal violence more broadly, and that's perhaps something we can talk about, manages to mask and to rationalize its own violence as legitimate force and to externalize violence as if it is the sole property or sole expression of those who resist the state. This becomes, I think, especially true in Palestine, and that's an example I'd like to talk about, which is also an example of colonial power, where Palestinian resistance is very often, not always, but very often cast as violent, even when it is nonviolent. So for instance, boycott, divestment, sanctions are nonviolent tactics, as are strikes, although strikes are very interesting because they're sort of on the cusp of violence and nonviolence. And yet they are always cast as acts of terror or threats to the state or indeed to the Jewish people, at which point Palestinian resistance is not only discredited, but becomes eligible for criminalization. And that is why we see the elaboration of enormous prison complexes within Palestine for all those who speak out against colonial injustice and colonial violence. So the prison then becomes the ultimate form of legal violence, and I hope we can talk about that in time.
Thank you very much. Professor Vergès, maybe if you want to, the floor is yours.
Merci, bonsoir.
Thank you, good evening. So the principal argument in my book, it really starts with different observations. So the huge disparity between the discourse of protection, the law as protection, the discourse of protection of children, of women, when we talk about dangers everywhere for children, and the incredible augmentation of violence from the state. So how are those two things, those contradictions existing? Who can be protected and who should not be protected? So it starts from there. And the second point is the criminalization. So as Professor Butler spoke of, the criminalization even of any act of dissidence, of discord, whether it's the movement of the support of Palestine or solidarity with refugees, the solidarity, for example, with protection in demonstrations against police. So that constant criminalization that actually is used for the protection of a, quote, good society, and that good society must be always protected by these people. And in French, in particular, we've seen it with the repression of the yellow vested, and it's also affected other people. So different communities that were most affected were racialized people. So that's that. And then, of course, the fact that the role that carceral feminism and punitive feminism plays in this. So it's in the justification of what the state is using, and this call that the state is making to protect themselves even more, which of course the state is the one creating these violences. So So it's between a saturation of violence and a state of permanent war, and not just the war, bombs that are falling on people, but war that is made every day in the global south, in poor communities, in racialized communities, and a constant discourse of protection that becomes even sentimental, very it's calling on on pity, on charity, these different sentimentalities that are being reproduced, that for me it makes an echo to colonial discourse from of protecting the civilized world from barbaric people. And so that's it's really an echo that I'm hearing. So it's coming from that reflecting from a place of talking about strategies of that people have put into place, of self-defense, and to see how do we imagine to work constantly to imagine a world that would be less saturated by violence. So for me, violence, it's not just a simply directly from the violence, but the constant violence that's made by capitalism, that's created by imperialism. So simply the fact that, of course, what we've seen with the pandemic has made that, we have exhausted bodies, we have, the so-called essential workers, over exhausted people that we've seen, that racialized capitalism and misogyny has shown, really comes from a constant violence. It's really an oversaturation on the day-to-day that are touching just all aspects of our life, when more and more we're seeing that the discourse of protection of nature, of bodies, of all that is multiplying with laws and spaces that they will be protected. There's a multiplication of reserves of such as parks and gated communities that are there reserved for the protection.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Professor Dorlin. Hi, thank you very much. Good evening, and thank you so much for this invitation. So my work, and thank you so much for interpreters. So my work, I really distinguish really the notion of legitimate self-defense, and what I'm trying to work on is talk about self-defense and really distinguish these terms. And on the notion of self-defense, namely, I'm thinking about current events in France, such as there's a few murders a few days ago. It was a passenger in a car, and during the intervention, it was during the intervention of the police, and while this car had been stopped and the driver had been called on by the police, and the refusal of the driver to cooperate somehow authorized the police to kill the driver. So that question of the legitimization of defense is really putting into question this issue of what democracy really is, and a Western European democracy. And also it can be a question that can be thought of, when we're in looking at the crisis of the states. So, and it really radicalizes what we can draw as a line. How do we delimitate who is allowed and permissible of being defended, and who are those who are being exposed to the risk of injury or death. And so socially, politically, and bodily, we see who has the right to be defended. So what is interesting to me is to really see the genealogy from the point of view of a philosophical, political view, and to try to understand the state and really rethink the state from a feminist and decolonial view. And what I've tried to show is that in the end, modern society is really constituted radically from roots that are so-called natural, and that say we're allowed to conserve our life and to legitimize ourselves, and that those rights And in the end, they really define citizens, and that in contemporary modern societies, we're rethinking this idea, and this right to conserve our lives is actually contractualizing in the larger society something with the state, and in return, state has the obligation to protect us, to protect its citizens, and to organize and to regulate the conflictuality of and the civility of society in front of tribunals and in front of a carceral institution. So that's the beautiful idea that our history has of us. But if we're remaking history from the point of view of the empire, if we're reclaiming these concepts from the perspective of the empire, if we're looking at questions of the society, of the citizen, of the individual, and we're looking at it from an imperial point of view, and we're on the imperial, on the empire's side, we really start to see that it's a very different situation where the question of legitimate self-defense is actually it's actually constituted from a colonial mindset, and historically and philosophically, the settler identity is what represents the citizens to whom the state is delegating all its powers and its rights of self-justice. So the right to kill. So in the end, these two Atlantic traditions. So if we're looking at France and the North American, we can really consider that in North America, there's always this possibilities for citizens to be considered vigilantes, where they can reclaim this right of self-defense in permanence, and to reclaim this idea of and this white idea of self-defense. And in France, we see it. We don't have that problem of legitimate self-defense that is weaponized, but there is a monopolization of violence by the state. So what I'm trying to show is that in the end, there isn't actually a monopolization per se, but there's this idea that there is a power over this, a dominant power over people that are racialized and gendered.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, si je vois bien que vous vous rejoignez beaucoup en termes surtout de la violence, notamment étatique, mais je dénote une certaine peut-être tension ici entre d'un côté une différence qui est faite.
So I see there's a tension here in a difference between the violence from the dominants and from the one that are defending themselves. I see that tension on one side.
This refusal to make a distinction between the violence used against us and the violence used to defend ourselves. Alors, est-ce que j'ai tort en disant qu'il semble y avoir une tension ici entre professeur Vergès, professeur Dorlin, votre vision de la violence et le projet que professeur Butler essaie d'approcher?
So what I understand is that there's some differences between those definition of violence that you manage. So I would let whoever of you want to rebound on that.
I think what I'm hearing is maybe something a little different, which is, on the one hand, there's a form of state violence that is expressed through police violence, and the rationale by which police violence legitimates itself. And then there are other forms of violence, colonial violence, that may be understood as state-centered, but also have to do with policies of protection, with administrative power, with regulations, which ways of producing and reproducing racist space and geography, and forms of legitimizing control and violent control of bodies through the rationale of protection. So I'm hearing sort of two different issues. The police who see it as their right, duty, freedom to extinguish the life of a driver of a car on the basis of some perceived racialization is different from, but related to the question of securitarian logics and the discourse of protection that seems to legitimate intensified social control. These are not in contradiction. The problem is that violence takes so many forms. And when we start talking about violence, we're talking about state violence. We could be talking about the military or the police. We could be talking about prisons. We could be talking about policy, administrative policy. We can talk about migration policy. Who's abandoned at sea? Is that not a violent policy? In what world is it the case that humanitarian actors in the Mediterranean are criminalized for trying to save the lives of those who are seeking passage? So that is rationalized in part through the idea of the protection of European territory, but also obviously white supremacy, right? And continuing colonial power. So I think we have many different versions of violence here, not just a kind of polarity. And I think we also need to think about psychic violence and the degradation of lives to the point of unlivability that can happen through slow forms of violence. Rob Nixon's term, which I think is quite useful. Over time, you're told you do not exist. You're treated as if you do not exist. Your existence is nullified time and again, not only by explicit state policy, police action, but by implicit policies or by the consequences of existing administrative policies. And I'm speaking too quickly and I will stop. Sorry, I forgot.
Thank you. No, that's fine. We'll have occasion to go deeper on that. Thank you. Françoise, Elsa, je ne sais pas si vous vouliez rebondir.
Maybe Elsa, Françoise would like to say something about that? Quickly. On what Judith was saying,
bien sûr, il faut différencier et spécifier les modalités de la violence.
obviously, we need to understand there's a different type of violence, different actors that produce violence and different institutions. Inside the state violence, obviously, there's differences and nuances. But we need to understand, we need to see a difference between state violence and the exercise of violence, which is more something that happens among people. We could even think there's a kind of rationalization of that way to delegate the role of being violent. Some lives and some people are going to be exposed to this violence because it's it's also an economical trade, right? You delegate that exercise of violence. That has to do with private property, the defense of it. It has to do with that idea that you have to defend your family, your private property. But violence itself, it's interesting, for example, to talk about non-violence tactic of struggle is actually a really interesting concept because it says it's not passive, it has to do with power. So, for example, when I'm talking about self-defense and violence, not with the intention of giving legitimacy to the use of violence. My intention is to understand violence in an outside of that framework that was imposed to us. There's an hegemonic perspective on understanding of violence. And if we understand violence in the sense that Frantz Fanon would understand it, we can understand that violence can be used in order to survive. That's sometimes the only thing that's left to you if you are exposed, if you are defenseless, because you're considered, because those lives are considered undefendable, not worth saving. So those lives are seen as expandable, are seen as killable. And so what can they do with that violence that goes through them? In the sense of Fanon, right? To transform that violence and to transform that violence into resistance practice that would allow us to demonstrate. And I'm not saying this is the first time in history, but now we're in a situation in which we need to understand political action as self-defense. Because it's as if we're defending the possibility itself of some lives, of living another way, facing a regime represented by the states, but also by the general structure of capitalism, as was saying Françoise. So it's a regime based on death. That see the risk of death of people in different ways.
Oui. Pardon. J'approche aussi la violence, enfin, pour rebondir sur ce que disait Judith et Elsa.
My perspective on violence has to do with the perspective of the fact that there's a world that you cannot habit in and in which I cannot breathe. So that the fact that it's not breathable. It's produced by police violence, but it's also produced by many other things. There's a situation in which you cannot even breathe. When I'm talking about when we're saying that, we're talking it's unbreathable. We're saying that we cannot talk, that we cannot express ourselves, that we cannot breathe. So that expression of slow violence, what you cannot see, sometimes there's a lot of ways of violence that you cannot see. It's not like the gun at the police officers. It's something that's maybe more subtle, everyday. It's exhausting your bodies, right? It's exhausting people. To retake what Gilmore was saying, it's fabricating death. There's millions of people that every day are dying before their time, and not because just of a war, because every day the actual conditions of life, the state and many of the other complicities give that permit to kill. There's segregation, and there's an economical system that put a limit to the kind of life that people can have. Billions of people, because of the economical system, are condemned to poverty and to die before their time. With the climate change, pandemic. So I'm also including that type of violence when I'm talking about violence. And that starts, as Elsa was saying, with colonizations. If we see that there's land that are contaminated, I mean, we're talking about policies from states that are contaminating lands and water and sending contaminations to other countries in the poorest communities and in the poorest countries. They're displacing that pollution there. So that's part of that violence I'm talking about. So I'd like to insist on that, on the fact that there's an extreme violence that is everyday life, an everyday life violence.
ce que dit Judith, parce que je trouve que c'est très important.
So
beaucoup
I think what Judith was saying is really important,
de manière trop, comment dire, d'avoir
because there's an exhaustion, let's say, because people are exhausted at the fact that maybe they use too much arm struggle at some point, and there's an exhaustion out of it.
plus récemment, justement, je parlais avec des amis de ça,
I was talking with some friends about that issue, how we can recreate sanctuaries, refuge. How can we get out of that life that is full of violence in order to rebuild ourselves? You know, places of life where solidarity, where we can read and rest.
Soumis à une constante violence, comment se défendre, et donc
Because
dans cette
we need to understand how can we defend ourselves.
Cette élaboration d'armes quotidiennes.
If our bodies have been exposed to violence, and if a response to that violence is more violence and it's using arms, it's just creating more exhaustion.
Ces personnes condamnées, mais de ces milliards de personnes condamnées à vraiment, il suffit de regarder les journaux. Et quand Judith parle de la Palestine, il y a évidemment la répression directe, mais il y a aussi...
When Judith is talking about Palestine, there's direct repression, but there's also the confinement in which is living the Palestinian people. For example, Gaza became a prison with there's a suffocation of Palestine. It's an open pit prison, and also the water is contaminated in Gaza. So to have to live in that ongoing everyday life violence is also another issue. That brings me to the second question, and I see there's questions in the Q&A coming in, so please feel free to ask your questions.
So your work, as you started telling us, your work talks about those who are not entitled to self-defense, to protection, or to grief. You criticize dominant discourses in institutions that promise security, protection, and defense to some on the backs of others. So the unprotectable, the undefendable, the ungrievable. Alors vous dénoncez, comme si j'ai bien compris, vous dénoncez ce qu'il y a de paternalisme.
You denounce what is paternalistic, patriarchal, racist, and colonialist behind these discourses and practice.
How can we protect ourselves and our communities without reproducing or reifying such carceral, securitizing, or paternalistic logic? Françoise, si vous voulez commencer.
Vous pouvez répéter la question en français?
Oui, bien sûr. C'est en gros vos travaux.
So
Oui,
if you could repeat the question.
Donc, vos travaux parlent des personnes qui n'ont pas
Your work talks about those who are not entitled to self-defense, to protection, to grief. So you criticize, you denounce what is paternalistic, patriarchal, and racist or colonialist behind these discourses and practice. Because how can we protect ourselves and our communities without reproducing, reifying such carceral, securizing, and or paternalistic logics?
Ces formes de logique carcérale, sécuritaire.
D'accord. Pardon, oui, d'accord. J'avais pas...
Yes, sorry. I'll listen to the first part, but then I didn't grasp the question. There's always been many ways to define ourselves, and there's still new ones.
intéressée à l'esclavage colonial.
For example, I've been studying colonial slavery. The history of slavery is an history of self-defense in the plantations. There was an ongoing effort to create, imagine new ways to resist that violence. Or, for example, when what's been calling marronnage. We have many examples of how slaves escaped and organized in palanques. So I would not even know how to answer, because I can't give you one example, because there's so many of them. We have examples every day. There's organization defending land, there's workers that are organized, sex workers are organized. People organize against feminicide. So that's how I don't know exactly how to answer your question, and I know it's a and I know it's a broad answer I'm giving you, because strategies of defense they always existed, and there's so many of them. I'm really sorry if my answer is not so clear or not so precise, because I wouldn't know how to give an answer to that. No problem.
Si vous voulez. Elsa, si vous voulez apporter
Elsa, if you want to give some elements of answer.
Si je dois prendre aussi cette question, elle est pour moi assez intéressante, parce qu'on a beaucoup.
For me, this is an interesting question. We've been talking about the state and the question of protection and how legitimate it is.
De stigmatisation et d'altérisation.
Which stigmatize or depolitize any other kind of collective way of organizing. So I'm going to give you a concrete example. A big part of contemporary social mobilizations are facing this situation. They're organizing and they're working on new forms of producing our own life conditions. So I'm just going to give you a really concrete example. In France, we had huge mobilizations that were called as ultra violent. It was all over the media. It was considered as awful violence, high intensity violence, because people were taking the streets to make their demands. So, for example, people occupied a land in order to protect it from a mega project of an airport that was to be built there. And people were facing police repression, and they were called as being the violent. So we're not even talking about defending yourself, about self-defense. The simple fact to go against neoliberalism, to get against those policies, and you're stigmatized as being violent.
Même sur le terme de légitimité, sur le terme de violence, sur le terme de droit, etc.
So there's an ideological struggle on those ideas of right, security. So there's a struggle over the words that you can use. So what I want to say there is the patriarchal dimension of what we've been calling a securitarian state.
Mais il n'empêche, il faut restituer cette tension extrêmement forte, et je prends l'exemple des violences
So I'm going to take the example of sexual violence. For example, should we denounce it legally or not? Should we go to the police knowing that the judicial system is supposed to repair, to protect us?
Raciste, classiste, et que faire? Ça a des conséquences qui sont en termes matériels qui sont
So it
absolument.
has material consequences that are,
But
whether
there's
it's
a lot
the
of
legal
impacts
fees, who is
on
allowed
that.
to
For
act in
example,
justice.
the costs, who has the money to actually use the tribunals?
Je ne dis pas du tout que la voie légale n'est pas un terrain de lutte. C'est un terrain de lutte, évidemment. Et il n'y a pas à choisir entre comment résister.
So for me, the tribunals is a place in which we can keep on the struggle. This is a field for the battle.
Radicaliser de politiques d'autodéfense qui relèvent de la subsistance alimentaire, de la subsistance en termes de lieux d'habitat, et que dans une certaine mesure, un des
Any
points
people who organize themselves in terms of habitat,
la question de la police et de la pénalité, c'est-à-dire comment
the whole question is always going around police. How would we live without police, for example? This is a question. Because a huge majority of the people cannot call the police to ask for protection.
La régulation du conflit, la question des rapports interindividuels, le fait que les rapports de pouvoir
The
traversent.
interindividual relationships. And so the last point I wanted to say.
So the last thing that I would like to say is the question of how do we resist without reedifying a certain way the patriarchal and racial dimension of this framework that we're living in. So one point about the fatigue, the exhaustion of bodies, the exhaustion of movements, of militants, of the possibility itself to resist. And maybe would then have a definition that would be a bit more narrow, but also more concentrated on what it actually means to have spared lives. Who are the lives that are privileged? So in part, it's lives that are probably are not living the experience of this intellectual, theoretical, effective, and intimate exhaustion that is affecting other lives that don't have the privilege to have to keep working to create, to elaborate different modes of resistance that are surviving. Thank you so much. Judith?
Answer as well.
Yes, I think that I'm aware that there are sort of two different usages of the term protection here. On the one hand, the questioner is wondering how do we gain protection from violence, and of course one of the problems that we've all pointed to is that protection is very often linked with paternalism, patriarchy, and even police powers, and even prison. So, in other words, very often the protection we seek, when we seek it legally or through the police, is one that opens up another sphere of violence, which is that of carceral violence. And Françoise has argued in her most recent work that feminists have made a mistake by turning to carceral solutions for protection against violence, that we have to find modes of collective resistance that are extra carceral, that are outside the carceral apparatus. And I think this is a problem because on the one hand, we expect laws to recognize sexual violence as a crime and to produce appropriate punishments. And when legal regimes are indifferent to sexual violence or do not have a concept of sexual violence as a crime, then we object. Why do you not recognize this as criminal, as violent? And why do you not recognize this as punishable? Now, it puts us, I think, in a bind at that moment, because we call for greater legal recognition and indeed even harsher punishments, but we are not asking the question, who is doing the punishing? What powers are we strengthening by asking the state to punish on our behalf? And this is, of course, an enormous bind for feminists, but also for trans people fighting violence, for gay and lesbian people, for non-gender conforming people, for indigenous struggles. We are all up against the state and its apparatus as both that to which we appeal and that which is its own economy of violence with a history of colonial violence, right? So that's our bind. But I would think that one area of commonality here is that, and I don't mean to efface the differences, but one area of commonality seems to me to be the call not for protection, but for empowerment, a call not for protection, but for active self-constitution, active self-determination in a collective sense, freedom, power, collective transformation as more important ultimately than protection, which also brings in the question of the agency we are asking to protect us. We can, of course, talk about self-protection, but are we just interested in protecting ourselves against an external violence? Well, yes, at some level. If I'm on the street, someone attacks me, I am interested in self-protection. But I'm also interested in producing the street as a place where I can walk without a problem. And as we're applauding Poland for giving sanctuary to the Ukrainians, we should remember that Poland has not protected its trans and queer youth, right? It has withdrawn legal protections for its trans and queer youth. It has pushed the Syrians and the Afghanis out or given them secondary status. So we need to see that protection always works differentially. We could say there's a kind of protection washing that the state of Poland engages in. Look how we protect the Ukrainians. Yes, and who are you not protecting? Right. What is the differential of power through which that operation of protection operates? And I would suggest that protection is very often in that logic, that it decides who will be protected and who will not. So we need to be very careful before we submit to that power or we appeal to that power.
There is no, pardon, je parle en français. Il y a une longue histoire
So there's a long history of protection in colonies. We had to, the first thing to protect was private property of settlers to protect white supremacy. So let's say that if there's injustice there for settlers, it's like what we saw last December. When we saw at the border of Vergès, there were people who were under they were below the law, as we were saying. So refugees, people on both sides of the borders that were police were, they were out there and there's people that were out in forests and that were vulnerable. And then months later, when you're welcoming refugees, those same people who were attacked by the police, then suddenly there was this humanitarian pulsion where refugees, they were welcomed as though, and politicians started saying it, that the people we would welcome were blonde and blue-eyed people. So really, there's this racial line of who gets chosen. So then, of course, there's people who are supposedly worthy of, it's the sex workers, there's trans people, there's queer people, refugees, like they're people put in incredible positions, and we can see that the borders in between the States and Mexico, there's a constant reproduction of a violation of rights. So, for example, within Europe, where that sees itself as that is full of rights, human rights for everyone, and there's zones within there where governments are just still talking about protection, but they're not actually providing. So for me, this creation of zones of non-bodies, it's zones of non-being. It's really, we see it in the Greek islands. We've seen it in La Chapelle in Paris. We've seen it in different border areas. In Belarusia, or between Poland and Ukraine today, we see this. There's zones of non-being where we're reproducing the same discrimination. If we're existing in a zone of non-being that, as Fanon had named, that's what he meant by it. Thank you so much. So if we're bouncing against this idea, I would like to go to questions from the public. There's a question that says, and I'm going to read it.
Last night, a sex worker was stabbed in Bois de Vincennes in Paris. Sex workers have always tried to fight against violence by self-defense practices, alert systems, and information sharing, but in the same time are also increasingly defined as victims by essence to deny our capacity to defend ourselves. How can we oppose violence when the state is considered the only legitimate source of violence, when we are actually the target of state violence, criminalized and illegitimized as political subjects and actors? Donc, c'est une grosse question. Je vous laisse digérer. Je vais en rajouter peut-être une ou deux autres et on pourrait essayer de voir comment répondre à certains de ces éléments.
Alors, so I would like to get to this question, and really, it's a dense question, but connecting it to what you've said, what distinguishes legitimate defense from non? How do we face ultra violence? How do you condition ourselves in situations of non-violence? And maybe a last little round of questions.
Yeah, political action as self-defense is interesting as a concept. Would I be wrong in associating something such as, for example, gun control in the USA as an action of self-defense for a racialized population? Alors, voilà, je vous laisse digérer ces trois questions. Et ensuite, quand
I will let you digest these questions, and if you would like to answer when you're ready.
Je suis désolée, j'ai pas bien entendu la dernière question. Pardon.
Would you just like to repeat the last question?
Je vous la répète. Political action as self-defense is
Political
as a concept. Would I be wrong in associating something such as, for example, gun control in the USA as an action of self-defense for a racialized population? Fait qu'en gros, le contrôle des armes à feu aux États-Unis pourrait-elle être vu comme une action d'autodéfense pour une population racisée?
Bon, ok, parce qu'en fait, il y a une collision dans les langues, mais ok. Je sais pas si j'ai tout capté. En tout cas, je vais juste réagir.
There's a collision between languages. So,
concernant la personne travailleuse du sexe.
So the person who was a sex worker who was stabbed last night in Paris, I'm really sorry. I did not know of this, but one thing that I would like to remind is that there's a wonderful association in Belgium for self-defense, for feminist self-defense that is training, it's training trainers to self-defense in a feminist lens. So there's different there's different optics, different trainings for women, for children, for youth, for queer people, for trans people, and non-binary people. So especially when we're talking about issues of assimilation, you know, it's really an extraordinary association. So it's a huge an important strategy towards self-defense. So they worked a lot with sex workers to be able to create these feminist self-defense trainings and workshops. So the roles were actually being inverted in these. The sex workers were actually the trainers, and they had so much knowledge, of course, from the day to day that was embodied, that was theoretical, that was so they had to survive on a daily basis. So the idea of the victimization and the criminalization of sex workers and the fact that we deny them rights had actually made that their main action of survival was that they had developed all these incredible self-defense strategies. And then the second thing I want to say is when we're talking about ultra violence, the question of where begins the legitimization, the legitimacy of resistance, of the use of violence. I try to put aside the question of the legitimacy and the illegitimacy of violence because, in my opinion, the discourse in political thought, the question of legitimacy is it's too stuck in an ideological struggle. It's stuck in this question of morality and of what's just. And really, it's actually based in a question of choice and a moral choice. But these different classical levels, let's say, are so indentured in an ideological stance concerning the state legitimization. So whether or the Western legitimization, or that we've been soaked in for so long that there's this. We actually, you know, we see that this legitimate distinction is very complex because of that. So my interest is really then to go look to a different scale of like what the question of action, of taking position and empowerment looks like. So rather than to try to judge what reactions, you know, what can I do that is legitimate, but instead to go back into a form of reflection that's more muscular, bodily, affective, almost individual, to go back to a question of movement. To see the political action in that. So, for example, if I'm taking the question of feminist self-defense, if a person is victim of violence and a sexual assault, and that person defends themselves, what does defending yourself well mean? What does defending yourself legitimately mean? So really, maybe running away is just escaping is legitimate self-defense. And during the assault, but also the question of the pre-aggression and the after assault, self-defense is this dignity that I can reassemble, that I can incorporate through different means, through different collectives, collective thoughts, to be able to get out, to be able to escape, to pursue my momentum, to be able to stay in this energy of living. So that's what I'm very, I take a certain step back when towards this question of legitimacy, because I think there's different means that we need to think of and look at it in a complete different optic and scale. So also, it's a question that's very intimate and very, very carnal, and we need to really change the whole dimension in which, and the whole temporality in which we think of it. So within, in what political time space are we thinking of this? In what time? And why at certain time does that work? Why do I scream at one time? And why in another moment does that scream stay stuck in my throat? Why does the moment of revolt work in one? And we need to think in completely changing the framework. And that's what we're doing, in fact.
Judith?
Judith?
Thank you. This is hard to follow because Elsa was very inspired, Let me just say, following on what Elsa just said, that one reason violence and nonviolence are not ultimately issues that belong to moral philosophy, like is it right to commit violence under this circumstance? Is nonviolence morally superior to violence? These abstract formulations that we tend to pose within moral philosophy don't really work. And one reason they don't work is because we cannot track how such arguments are being used in a field of power, right? Like, who is saying this and for what reason, right? We need to take all those propositions and rethink them. Who's claiming that violence is legitimate? And what work does that claim do to exclude or to misname or efface forms of resistance that ought to be? I think one of the things that happens when we start arguing about violence and nonviolence is that we forget that those arguments take place in a world in which those terms are already monopolized and mobilized for very specific reasons. So our moral philosophy has to turn into a discourse analysis and a political analysis in order to start to make sense at all. As for gun control, I think that it is a question of racial justice and even a reparations issue in the United States. As early as 1840, as I understand it, violence was used in southern states. Gun violence was used to subordinate slaves and also to intimidate abolitionists. So the right to bear arms was a right that belonged to a slave owner, and it was the right to control and subordinate one's chattel, one's property, including obviously one's slaves, slaves being understood as chattel. But also, interestingly enough, and this is really important because this is where we see interlocking forms of power, the arguments made for the freedom to bear arms were also based on an idea of manhood. If your manhood was assaulted or offended, you would be able to defend your masculine honor through the use of a gun. And so, and this use of gun violence was a daily occurrence in the South, and weapons were understood not only as a way for white men to protect themselves against slaves, but also to protect their women against perceived sexual advances by slaves. So in order to stop miscegenation from happening, even though, as we know, white slave owners were free to sexually exploit Black slaves as they wish, right? So it's their property relations, there's masculinity, patriarchy, and slavery, white supremacy. All of these issues are involved in gun control and in the right to bear arms in the United States, at least. So I think as a way of making reparations for the for slavery, we should pass gun control laws because they work differentially to support white supremacy, masculinity, and property relations. So that is my argument. That's my way of understanding it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Françoise?
Oui, la remarque que faisait Elsa sur la question de sortir du légitime, illégitime.
What Elsa was saying about getting out of that debate between legitimacy or not, I think it's really important. I have a different answer to give. We need to understand that rage and anger are necessary, right? We need to be full of rage about what's going on, and it's not a negative feeling. It's a deep and important feeling for struggle. Rage is really important. There's also tenderness, solidarity, and other feelings that interact with rage and anger. And that's needed. But for me, anger is political if it's well used and canalized. Because we have to go against this kind of passivity, saying like, oh, things are like this, the world was always this way. This is something that's produced every day, you know, like a way to naturalize the violence that is around us. And so there's a rationalized perspective on violence that's shown as natural. This is the situation in France. Young Arab and Black male are seen as potentially dangerous, and so I think it's part of a struggle against that phenomenon to recognize rage. I think that patriarchal violence based on police and the army, and that state violence that use torture, rape, assassinations, usually in total impunity, you know, they terrorize people, right, to produce fear. So how do we get over that fear, right? That's part of the strategies that we need to talk about. Because fear is something that's essential to power. If you fear to be punished for protesting, if you fear of being jailed, if you campaigns on social networks and other, you know, other ways to scare people. So there's an ongoing censorship, in that deep sense of censorship, to suppress what would be rage and anger. So women that are pissed are seen as hysterical, right? So this is the kind of repression we're facing. So I do think we need to give back to anger and to rage their value and their positive values. So that idea of you know, getting over fear and terror, usually it's a solidarity and love among people that are the tool that can help to face fear. You cannot face fear by yourself. So on that issues of anger and rage, it's important because often you're going to be told if you're presenting things in a good way, if you were polite, if you were calm, we would listen to you. But if you're not, then we won't. Why? I mean, we have to yell sometimes. and we shouldn't be afraid of it. And sometimes we cannot be polite in front of a situation. That policy of being respectful, it's a policy of pacification. So those policies of pacification are implemented through the criminalization of any kind of movement that try to change the current state of things. Elsa was mentioning it, right? So the process of pacification is opening a little bit the door, co-opt a few person that were demanding, maybe someone's that's maybe a person that is racialized, maybe a woman, to integrate them and tell them, see, we can integrate you. If you're polite, everything's going to go well. So we need to fight against those measures of pacifications. This is what they usually use, right? The carrot and the stick. And in France, you see that all the time. You know, you repress a part of the people and then you open a little bit the door so that 2 or 3 representatives from those groups that are demanding can be seen as an example, that if you accept the laws of a state and of patriarchy, then you're going to be listened at, and then you're going to have a space, right? And it's a strategy that allows a state to divide social movements in general. And the amount of assassination we're seeing, like Marielle Franco and others. Actually, you're going in my third question, so I was like, maybe I can ask it, because actually the third question has to do with that. So I thought it was a good moment to jump in. So what I wanted to ask is the fact that your work offers interesting avenues for thinking about resistance against racist, sexist, sexual, state, and economic violence.
Professor Butler, you write about aggressive nonviolence rooted in social bonds. Professeur Vergès, vous parlez du droit au paisible. Vous l'avez un peu soulevé tout à l'heure.
Mrs. Vergès, you speak of the right to peace, to peacefulness. And Professor Dorlin, you're talking about the martial ethic of the self. So what they do to bodies and what they open up as possibilities. What tools of resistance can these notions offer in the face of a rising far rights movement, for example?
Alors Françoise, justement, si vous voulez continuer ce que vous étiez en train de nous dire ou embarquer sur autre chose.
Non, ça va, je peux attendre encore.
En fait, c'est votre tour. Alors, si vous voulez.
No, that's your turn, actually. So that's why I was... I was not listening to you. No, the idea that you could go on.
Alors, Judith, do you want to answer?
Yes. I think maybe we heard in Elsa's last contribution a double reference to the idea of movement, right? We think of social movements, political movements, but if I'm right, Elsa is also talking about the movement of the body, a body that can move, has a freedom of movement. Maybe we could think here as well about Françoise mentioning at the very beginning of this conversation, the ability to breathe, right? So these are basic life functions, like who can move, who can breathe? We ask those questions before we even ask who can speak and make a political claim. And if we go back to the problem of the carceral state, which is a form of violence that has an enormous history in colonization, in racial subordination, but also in sexual violence. we have to ask what is it that is done to bodies when they are contained, criminalized, pathologized, and we have to ask that question, in my view, both in the context of the prison and the prison system, but also in the ways in which carceral power functions outside the prison as part of everyday life, a part of power in everyday life. Because when we're on the street, we're also in legal domains. There's a question of police. There's who's there to protect, who's there to hurt, what possibility is there to move and to breathe. And one of the things that I have taken from Elsa's work on self-defense, which I think is really important, is that, let's see if I can bring this up, is the thesis that social powers do not merely act on the body as external forces. They actually come to inhabit the body, and they compose the way that people live their very materiality. And what is targeted through carceral power is we might say the basic life forces of the body, the desire to live or to move or to express something about one's life and to survive. So what gets attacked are what we might call life forces, which is why the struggling to exist under conditions of intense oppression becomes an exhausting struggle to survive, right? And Françoise actually talked to us about exhaustion. Many people in contemporary race studies talk about exhaustion as the condition of Black life. Claudia Rankine and others, which is not to say that there isn't renewal or that there isn't rising up or uprising or radical resistance, but there can only be resistance where there is the capacity to regenerate the basic life of the body. And where is that? Where does that take place? In my view, social movements are not just acting on the street or acting in various public spaces, but they are also networks for the regeneration of life itself, of the body, of its capacities, and that without that regenerative network, we cannot fight. We cannot continue to fight. We're not pure machines. We're not just political in the moments where we're acting most emphatically. We are also political when we insist on the regeneration of life force, of the very capacity to live. So I don't know if that really addresses the issue, but that's what I have to offer.
Yes, thank you very much. Françoise?
Oui, c'est dans la création pour moi, de ces espaces où on...
For me, that's in the creation of those spaces. To retake what Judith was saying, to regenerate our body and also what we have in our heads. That question of exhaustion, physical and mental, for me, it become a biggest issue because there's less and less space in which you can rest. So that the right to rest is not authorized. When I was talking with refugees, they were talking about the fact that during 3 years of their life, they could not rest at any moment. In French, we say sleep on one eye. Because they always had that tension that the police would come or fascist militia would show up. So they were in constant unrest. So that idea to have space in which you can rest, you can retake strength, regain strength, I think it's an essential question today, because I have that feeling that that space in which we can breathe is getting smaller, is shrinking. If we take the example of France, even the freedom to manifest is shrinking, right? We're gassed whenever we take the streets. The police have tactics to cut the protest in several pieces so that people would be separated. That has an impact on that collective body, right? So there's a collective body taking the streets, and so the police tactic is actually to cut it down so that it could undermine that strength, that collective strength in the street that is being visible, right, when it's from the street. So that ongoing attack, on the right to breathe, to rest, to regenerate, it's a really key issue. So this is why I was telling that for me, there's a question of how can we recreate sanctuary. There's the example of Rwanda Road. There's examples of sanctuary against fascism in colonial war. During the Algerian War, a sanctuary and refuge was essential for fighters. For Algerian fighters, it was essential to have some sanctuary to rest. So we need those networks in which we can regenerate our energy in the social movements, but also physical space. Because we need space in which we can regenerate that battle force, but also places in which we can have imagination again and be creative about resistance, because we're always in that ongoing resistance action that kind of stuck you into reacting only, right? You just always react. A Palestinian researcher 2 weeks ago was supposed to do a conference in Vienna 2 weeks ago, and she couldn't do it because they make it it was prohibited. So we've been sending letters. We're going to keep on doing that for 2 months. So we're always reacting to what's happening, right? And we cannot open space. We're kind of stuck in that space. So solidarity movements are really important. Social movements are really important because effectively it's the space in which we can experience joy. Or even unconsciousness for a few minutes. Gilmour called it life in rehearsal. Those moments in which we kind of practice. We can practice for that world we would love to live in. We need those moments, moments that can let us see a gasp of what it could be, right? Another world. So the freedom of speech, the freedom of movement are blocked all the time, and Elsa's talking about that a lot. About how your body need to regain that strength. And so this is why that we need to fight against that exhaustion. And we need to fight against an economy that's based on extractivism, and not just extractivism of commodities, but extraction of ideas, extraction of the ideas we have. There's a cannibal way to take our ideas and spit them out as pacified, right? And it's part of what's exhausting. So Elsa Elsa was saying, let's not get into that debate of legitimacy. And let's work on our own imagination. Let's create space to work on our imagination. We need to work on it really seriously. We need to imagine new possibilities.
Et justement, si on retourne à des questions du public, il y avait des questions justement sur comment recréer des refuges et des sanctuaires ou des endroits de vie dans la lutte. Et donc, une question qui est similaire. Donc, any ideas on how to deal with the violence even while facing extreme exhaustion from the ongoing violence? Donc, ça va un peu dans ce que vous avez commencé à répondre, Françoise.
So we also have another question that's asking about what do you think about mutualization and questions of alliances so that the struggles against violence are not just the responsibility of vulnerable populations? So really, we're facing more practical questions of resistance. So from the main direction, we're talking about how is gendered violence and having to face different different facets. You, on one hand, they have to be conscious of the racial facets of it, and so there's these double inhibitions. So how can you face this double inhibition, and what are some can you speak to some of those contradictions that can be inherent to them? So I'll start with Elsa, please.
Je vais peut-être répondre juste à...
So I would love to answer the previous question.
Mais ça va peut-être répondre à quelques questions.
So this might actually answer the other questions, but we'll see.
Parce que vous avez cité l'expression.
So you cited the expression of martial ethics, the martial ethics of self. So when we're talking about people who are enslaved, practices of resistance, so how can we reconstitute them within the larger historical traces that have been preserved, but also in the memory of imaginaries as well, in the memories of bodies, and as well as Françoise mentioned, this transmission from generation to generation of so this transmission, this ability to create and struggle modes of struggling. So we can talk about different exercises of self, of struggle. So we saw it in reference to the person who died. So this idea of preparation. So maybe the moment, the political moment starts in the preparational, in the foreshadowing, in the knowing that we might be able to characterize the matrix of domination to the different modes of at our disposition. So on one hand, there's a legitimization of this resistance to confrontation. The regime that we live in does not want us to be confronting. So it's creating means for us not to. So it's reducing means for us to. So we could be functioning, through modes of fear, terror tactics, and create fear in an exemplary way. So meaning the more you resist, the more you will suffer. And I'll show you this on the bodies of others as a means of creating fear. So we're producing this kind of subjectivity, this dominant subjectivity behind the screen that's telling itself, until up to here, it's not me, I'm fine. So it's this idea of internalization, this empowerment to act. So for example, we spoke of forms of domestication of the individual. We also spoke of forms of distortion of psychic distortion that it creates. So for example, the world is saying to me to not to move, but me inside, I'm enraged. Inside me, I'm demanding justice. My rage is boiling, and I feel disempowered, or I'm terrified. So all those different modes are coexisting, and and the and the process of politicizing life at that moment is then crucial to prepare. So it's where when we're in that tension of what Judith called being out of self, a state of ecstasy of being out of self, and also what Françoise named as and theorized as the refusal of a peaceful life. So it is that idea of being exhausted, of being in this exhaustion of self. And so really to get out of self, to be exalted as a means of power, to reassert ourselves as an exercise of self-assertion. It goes through questions of solidarity, means of solidarity and mutual aid grounds and common meeting places, the question of resources, of food security, of the question of commonalities, of possible communities and that are being explored. But if we're talking really about this question of preparation for combat, it goes through the preparation of violence. It goes through the question of anticipating what I will do, what I can do. And really those political imaginations is a source of joy because it's very material, it's very concrete, it's something that's nourishing us, it's preparing food, it's preparing for demonstrations, it's preparing a strike, preparing a celebration, a party. It also signifies a means to prepare confrontation. So we have resources for that. I'm thinking in particular, fundamentally what Simone Gregg says on striking. She speaks of the pure joy of striking, of the preparations for a strike. So she names those things as things that constitute us, and we see it today with feminist, queer, trans feminist movements in Argentina that are preparing, that are singing, that are mobilizing, and they're end up throwing Molotov cocktails and at tribunals and at police, and we see it coming all together.
Françoise?
Now to Françoise, please. What Elsa just said is very important because I always keep militant moments and mobilization moments as moments of preparation than the memory of the actual action itself. The before and after are way more vivid in my memory than the actual moment. So for example, so obviously all those preparations, but also imagining, what it could be. And then the after is being able to say, hey, we did it, and basking in that. So that's what stays in our memory. And often in discussions that I've had with people I've milited, I've struggled with, the memories that come back to us is often the preparation or the post debriefing. Maybe it's the lunch we had after, or the drinks we had after the action. That's the things that we remember. It's the moments that are very important because it's the moment of desire and of joy. And it really, and these things really escape the whole economic capitalist idea, this idea of extraction, these constant attacks that are on the self. So we're reminded of what it does to us psychically. So these are psychic machines. One book that a psychoanalyst wrote is called "The Effort to Sell the Other Crazy One." I think it's a very telling title. It's the effort takes to make us feel crazy. The effort, not crazy like I'm crazy full of joy, but crazy. It's a very striking title because you know, we think, for example, of this question of mental health, you know, what we call mental health today, an expression that I think is very problematic. You know, how physically do we have these spaces of a practice of these where these things can, these moments can escape the general perception of others, the separation ourselves from others that is constantly being repeated. So all the social movements do this, but it's the idea of transmission. That's also a source that's extremely important to be able to externalize ourselves, to be able to transmit something constantly. I think also for myself, what is I'm hearing from this is this fact that there's always an impulse to fight. It never stops, it never goes away. Even in the strongest colonial night, as Fanon said, it never ends. This impulse, it's this enormous life force that runs through us constantly. It can't completely take down dictatorships and patriarchy and all that, but it's something that is also the most scary to the big powers that be, is that this idea, they try to destroy this life force. Maybe this is where this question of the body comes in. It's this body that refuses to submit itself. So for me, it's also a question of leaning into this life force. So really to remind ourselves that it's there, that it does not go, it does not go away, it's indelible. It's an enormous impulse. Like when we're citing the women in Chile, or we see the young Mexicans that are women that are taking on these lines of police officers, it's completely incredible. It's such a force. You see this life force that cannot be contained. It's always being channeled, and that's what they're scared of, the state. And like Judith and Elsa said, this impulse is always public. Despite all the public punishing and incarcerations, this life force is the question to express ourselves, and it continues. And it's a constant struggle between this war that is created to stave off this life force.
Ouais, merci. Judith, le mot de la fin. C'est à vous.
Judith, if you'd like to finish for us.
Okay. There's so much now. No? C'est beaucoup.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Briefly, I want to draw attention briefly to the destruction of the earth that is happening as we speak, the processes of extractivism, which have to be thought through in their complex modalities. I want to suggest that that extractivism not only takes precious metals out of the earth and destroys the earth as a as a place for living communities, but it also attacks the life world of indigenous peoples, especially in Brazil, in Chile, in the US, and in Palestine. I've been struggling lately with the fact that the constitutional court in the state of Israel, in the case of Masafar Yatta, a small Palestinian village in the West Bank, decided that the demolition of homes was legitimate, that the police harassment of inhabitants of those homes is legitimate, and in general, that police violence against Palestinians who are improperly occupying Israeli lands is legitimate. It's an attack both on land and on people. And we, I think, have lived too long with the idea that land and people are radically separable. But in the case of Palestine, the land and the people are actually intertwined. Like who one is part of that land. What that land is part of one's life. And that interconnection is extremely important. And we've seen this also, I think most emphatically in Brazil right now, where Bolsonaro's attack on indigenous peoples is also part of extractivism, its logic, and its violence. And unfortunately, but importantly, this is also happening through the courts. So it becomes a form of legal violence, right? It is established as legitimate by courts such as the Israeli Conseil Constitutionnel. I don't know what they call themselves. They're like a Supreme Court. So I think this brings us back to the question of life. We've talked about life force, wanting to live. What do we mean by life? The right wing has an idea where I live that it will deny women the right to abortion on the basis of life. They use life to support their claims. But what if we had a feminist, trans, queer, left, anti-racist, anti-colonial philosophy and politics of life? I think as we're calling for new spaces and ways of imagining, I think we need to reclaim the living process, the life of the earth, of habitation, the life of bodies. I think we need to reclaim the vital and the living for our struggle. They cannot own that. They cannot own that. So I'm also reminded of the importance of Silvia Federici's work on these issues. And I also want to say that in Palestine, one very often sees a placard where people are holding up a sign that says, "We exist." I mean, maybe I should say it differently, like, we exist, but it's also kind of ironic and understated, like, we exist. But under what conditions does claiming existence constitute a political act? Well, under conditions in which that existence is systematically denied. There are no Palestinians, there is no Palestinian land. There is no Palestinian life to take away because Palestinians do not live. Like under those conditions of intense colonial violence, we have to understand that the right to live and the right to exist are radically political assertions